Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for having joined us so early on a Saturday. You know, the INHA and the Château de Fontainebleau are happy to welcome you to the 9th Festival of Art History. This morning's conference is going to deal with church architecture in the 19th century and religion in the 18th and 19th century. Our speaker, Arne Bugge Amundsen from the University of Oslo. I hope you'll appreciate this presentation. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. If you have questions at the end of the conference, you raise your hand and I will give you a microphone, which is essential because we want to be able to record your questions because the conference is in fact being recorded so that it can be published online. So I give you the floor now to our speaker of the day. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very happy to be here in Fontainebleau. As the title suggests on the screen, this will be a lecture based on the relationship between architecture and religion in Norway, with a special emphasis on the 18th and the 19th centuries. And the lecture is also organized as what one might call a journey through recent Norwegian history and a series of images. So I hope you will take this challenge to, in a way, explore together with me the relationship between architecture and religion. And as a very simple start, I will just remind the audience about some historical realities of Norway. As you might be aware of, and I will come back to the importance of the Middle Ages in Norwegian historiography later, the Kingdom of Norway was actually what could be called a Northwest Atlantic Empire in the High Middle Ages. Its extension was enormous. What linked the different parts of this empire together was the sea. And this North Atlantic Empire lasted until the mid-14th century. Actually, it ended with the Black Death. After the mid-14th century and until early 16th century, Norway was united with Denmark and Sweden in different royal unions. There was one king being the king of all these three kingdoms. But the most important thing I would like to emphasize now is that what, in a way, was the main structure of the Norwegian society after the Black Death was the Roman Catholic Church. There was no separate king of Norway. The kings never were in Norway. They were mostly settled in Copenhagen. So the main center, and I will just show you this map, the main center of Norway actually was the city of Trondheim, where the Norwegian archbishop was residing. The different kings were sitting down here. This was the political center of this royal union, but the political and administrative center of Norway was Trondheim, then linking together all Norway, the Shetland, the Orkney Islands, the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland. It was an enormous North Atlantic area with the Roman Catholic Archbishop in Trondheim as its head. The dramatic change of this structure took place with the introduction of the Lutheran Reformation in Norway and Denmark, which took place between 1536 and 1537. And if we compare the Lutheran Reformation in Denmark and Norway with other Lutheran Reformations, there were several of them, it was one of the most radical and dramatic of them all. And the political architect behind this radical shift in both religion and politics was our friend on the screen, King Christian III, who was the ruler of Denmark and Norway between 1536 and his death in 1559. And for the first time since the Middle Ages, Norway now was defined not as a kingdom of its own, but actually as just a province of Denmark. And to, in a way, make this very clear, King Christian III simply removed the archbishop. He fled to the Netherlands. All the Norwegian bishops were imprisoned and sentenced. And what was left was a Lutheran state church, not with bishops. They were removed. They were replaced by so-called superintendents with very limited power and with strict control from the king in Copenhagen. So in fact, there was no separate church of Norway. There was no archbishop, not formally bishops either. It was just a state-controlled religious organization, which of course had to introduce radically new rituals. And it slowly started also to change the interior of the churches, because anything that could remind the population of the Roman Catholic past had of course to be removed. At least this was the political ideal. But the problem was, through these enormous political changes, most of the political power was taken away from Norway, centralized in Denmark and Copenhagen, and this actually created Norway as a quite poor country, both economically and culturally, just being a province far to the north. It was extremely far from Copenhagen to Finnmark, for instance, in the northern part of Norway. So in reality, what was left in the Norwegian parishes was actually the old Roman Catholic churches. They were not removed, they were not torn down, and it took quite a long time before they really were changed symbolically and with regard to interiors, etc. And the problem was very simple. The king had no money to build new churches. So in fact, in spite of this radical ideological and political shift, the legacy from the Middle Ages and the Roman Catholic past was still around. It was not immediately changed. So very few new churches were built in the 16th and 17th centuries in Norway. People could not afford to build new churches, to put it simple. So the real change, and that now I'm coming to the core of my lecture, actually took place in the 19th century, the 18th century, in the 1700s. And again, there is a new king and even a new Christian, this time King Christian VI, who was the main architect behind the changes that took place also in religion and in church architecture. You can see him here, his portrait as member of a royal family. I think the portrait is from the early 1730s. He was a very shy man, a very tiny man, but he had very strong religious ideas. He was theologically very active. So he had very precise preferences with regard to changes in religion, theology, and church. And many of his ideas came from this gentleman, the Count Zinzendorf from Germany, from Saxony, Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, who actually was a relative of King Christian VI's queen. King Christian invited this count to his court already in 1730, and Count Zinzendorf is historically famous for having established the Moravian Church, a very radical pietist church, quite non-confessional, but deeply involved with the question of interiorizing religious values and standards in a new way. And you see on this very idealized portrait of Count Zinzendorf, showing how he, inspired from God, from divine powers, has the religious influence directly imposed into his heart. This was a heart religion, very emotional, and with all the audience listening to him as an inspired reformer of religion in his time. So this is one of these most important inspirations for King Christian VI in his church reforms. And one common denominator between both the traditional Lutheran orthodoxy, pietism, Moravianism, and when it came to that later in the century, the Enlightenment movement, was actually the question of bringing new light to individuals, to enlighten both the hearts, the lives of people, and society in general. And one of the main concerns of all these both movements, ideas, and ideologies was a new emphasis on the value of the religious individual. That's one of the core ideas here. And as we saw on the portrait of Count Zinzendorf, this religious individual should have the Word of God implanted into his or her heart. That was the idea, symbolically and also psychologically. And of course, this extremely concentration on the religious individual put pressure and problematized the idea of a general congregation as the core element in the church organization. So the pietists, the Moravians, were more occupied with what they called the ecclesiola, the little church, the small church. The ecclesiola in ecclesia, the small church in the big church. That was their ideal. So they were looking for how to create some kind of epicenter of the church, both locally and nationally, because they thought this new group, this ecclesiola, could inspire others to behave like they did themselves. And this created also new challenges to church architecture. That will be my point in the following. Because how could you both give room for the individual believer and at the same time still focus on the general, the big congregation, which was expected to meet in the church as well? Actually, two cultures in one, unified in one architecture. That was the problem. That was the challenge. So, of course, this creates both a need for a new simplicity in church architecture, and it at the same time opens for an ideological complexity, and I will show that more in detail. It also has to be said that at least this early 18th century interest in pietism and Moravianism was an elite phenomenon in Denmark and Norway. It was not a popular movement, meaning that people in general didn't care so much about it. So this was changes that was imposed from above. Most congregations didn't care so much about it, but they would have seen the new tendencies through these new churches that were built in local communities. But my point is that Enlightenment, both as a philosophical tendency and also Enlightenment as a physical reality, more light into the church rooms, was a common denominator. So if you try to compare the churches that actually survived the Lutheran Reformation in Norway, the stave churches, they were very dark, brown, black interiors, small windows, very little enlightenment there, or these cold stone churches from the Middle Ages with also very little light in them. They were very dark. The change is very radical to, for instance, this Christian, the XIXe church, built in 1738 in Elverum in southern Norway. This is definitely not a stave church, as you can see. The colors are relatively light. The church room is almost drowning in light. Nothing could take place in this church without everyone seeing it in full daylight. And you can at the same time see some Baroque style elements here. I mean, this is still early 18th century. But this use of light, open squares, and given the possibility of the congregations to see very clearly where the minister was standing when he gave his sermon. He was standing up on the pulpit, of course, and full access to the central piece of the church, the altar. This is a typical early 18th century pietist church, inspired directly from the religious ideals of King Christian VI. And of course, King Christian was everywhere. As, for instance, in this church in Tyldal, not far from Trondheim, built 2 years before. What you see here is, it's much of the same. You see some older Baroque elements, of course. The altarpiece is quite Baroque, but it's this open and lighted part of the church, full access to the altarpiece, but with this enormous symbol of King Christian VI, actually larger than God himself. This is the monograph of King Christian in the ceiling. It fills the whole choir. It's enormous. And here you can see some more details from the same church. So this combination of light and Baroque colors and the symbols of the ruling king. If we go, King Christian VI, he died in 1746, but his changes of the ideals of church architecture actually ruled most of the 18th century church building in Norway. And we can go to another example. Klebu Church, also not far from Trondheim. It's actually octagon, and it's more or less constructed as a lecture hall. Lots of light, easy to find a place to sit, even divided between 2 floors. And you can even see how now the minister is placed in the center of the whole structure. The pulpit is actually above the altarpiece. So no one should be in doubt of what was the central element of an architecture like this. The word of God coming from above and being implanted in the individual hearts of the audience. This is a religious instruction or lecture hall. Also very close to the ideals of the goal of enlightenment, be it Moravian or pietist. Light colors, sunlight everywhere, and easy access to the word of God. So, my attempt at analyzing this church architecture from the 18th century is that most of these churches, they are rooms for individual meditation. All the symbols in the church interior was accessible to anyone. They were also arenas for religious instruction. No one could, in a way, avoid to listen to the word of God and see the minister giving instructions. They were extremely, actually more than before, centered around royal power. The royal symbols were everywhere in these churches. So there was no doubt that the absolute monarch in Copenhagen was the chief of everything. He was the one who controlled everything. The position of the clerics, of the ministers, were even more central than before. It was perhaps more centered, that has to be said, around the ecclesia and not the ecclesiola. And it has to be linked to two very important religious reforms that were introduced in both Denmark and Norway under Christian VI. The obligatory confirmation rite introduced in 1736, making it obligatory for all Norwegians and Danish to be able to read and write. So this was also an attack on analphabetism. And the school reform in 1739, making it obligatory for all young people between 7 and 14 years to learn to read and write. So, because without being able to read and to write, you could not, in a way, have this enlightenment put into your heart. You should be able to study religion yourself. And in the 19th century, there was a very famous Norwegian painter called Adolf Tiedemann, who, in a series of paintings and drawings and etchings, tried to describe the ideals from the previous century about how religious life should look like. And on the screen now you see, I think it's an etching from the 1850s, showing not the minister, but the local teacher, the local school teacher, using the church as an arena for instruction. There is some irony or humor in this picture. I think, the young people don't look very inspired by the teacher, but still, I think this is quite typical for what was going on in these churches. But Adolf Tiedemann also was very clear that not all religious life took place in the churches. One of these ecclesiola ideas from the previous century was that the believers should actually gather in private homes to study the word of God with the knowledge they had of writing and reading. This is also a very important work by Adolf Tiedemann, again from the 1850s, called private piety, or husandakt in Norwegian, meaning a religious ceremony taking place in the home, where you see an elderly man and a woman reading, not necessarily in the Bible, but in a religious book at least. Thus, in a way, also showing that the new ideals from the previous century, to a certain degree, had found its way into popular culture. I will leave the 18th century by these images and go further to the 19th century. Because in 1814, Norway all of a sudden became, for the first time since the mid-14th century, a separate kingdom. During the negotiations in the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and Denmark then being allied with France actually, the winning powers decided that Norway should be taken from Denmark, without negotiations with the Norwegians of course, and given to Sweden as a compensation for Sweden's loss of Finland in 1809. This started a very intense and complicated political process in Norway, because in this period between the negotiations between the superpowers of Europe and Sweden actually understanding what was going on. The Norwegian elite, in combination with a number of peasant representatives, actually created a constitutional assembly. So by the 17th of May 1814, representatives of the Norwegian society had written and signed a constitution of this new monarchy, Norway. So when the Swedish king in the summer of 1814 said, well, Norway is mine. Come on, Norway is mine. They said, well, you have to negotiate with us. And in the first place, the Norwegians didn't accept the Swedish king as their king. They had elected another king. So between the 17th of May and early November 1814, Norway had a king of its own, Christian Fredrik. But of course the Swedish king did not accept this, so during a short war, summer and early fall 1814, Sweden actually conquered militarily conquered Norway. But for some reason, and I won't go deeply into that, the Swedish king accepted the Norwegian constitution. And he also accepted that Norway should have its own government, its own currency, its own laws, and its own state administration. So, very different from the position of Norway until 1814 being a province under Denmark and Copenhagen. The so-called union between Sweden and Norway was a union between two separate kingdoms. So what Norway and Sweden had in common was the king, the defense, and the foreign policy. Except from that, the two nations were very separate and had individual cultures and even church organizations. So what happened quite immediately in 1814 was that Norway got its own Ministry of Ecclesiastical Affairs, and I will come back to that. For first time since the Middle Ages, Norway was actually able to organize its own church affairs, and the new Norwegian authorities started to regulate church rituals, church architecture, and, for instance, graveyards. In the same years, actually during the Napoleonic Wars, Norway, for the first time, also was deeply influenced by more popular pietist revival movements. Very different from what was going on around pietism one century before. And in 1845, the Norwegian parliament also passed a law saying that it was able to be a Norwegian citizen, but still not being a Lutheran. So in 1845, Norway got, I think it was Europe's most liberal religious legislation, opening the possibilities of Roman Catholics, Methodists, Mormons, Baptists, whoever could come to Norway, could establish their own churches and still be full members of the Norwegian society. So, in a way, religious affairs was more a question of organizing the affairs or the relationships between different denominations, but at the same time, and this influenced church architecture deeply, it was an important issue for Norwegian politicians and academics to create what we today would call a Norwegian national identity on the ruins of the old union between Denmark and Norway. So there was a big quest, both in aesthetics and in historical studies and in other academic disciplines too, to find out what was deeply Norwegian, what was historically Norwegian, and it was quite natural then. That was why I shortly showed you the medieval history of Norway, to return to the Middle Ages as this grand period of Norwegian independence and culture. So all of a sudden, in a formerly Lutheran country, the Roman Catholic past became one of the main periods in historiography and in the way of thinking. I will just show you one image, also very iconic in Norwegian art history, again by Adolf Tiedemann, showing this new situation with this new pietist movement, with one of the main ideologies behind it, Hans Nielsen Hauge, in the center, showing how they, in a very old-fashioned peasant home, have their own religious rituals. If you compare this picture with the picture I showed you of Count Zinzendorf, there are some similarities. There's light coming from above. In this case, both the light from the opening in the roof, which was common in peasant dwelling houses at the time, but also the religious light, enlightening coming from above, via the preacher, this lay preacher, and reaching then the audience with women and men, children and old people. I will come back to how these people organized their architecture. But first I would like to return then to what I just said, this new interest in Norway for the Middle Ages. And then I have to return to Trondheim. I remind you of the fact that Trondheim was the center, administratively and definitely religiously, in Norway until the Reformation. That was the see of the archbishop, and there was, for northern countries, northern areas, a quite substantial, quite impressive medieval cathedral there. So it's fascinating, for instance, that Trondheim and the Trondheim Cathedral already in 1814 became a very important political and national symbol. There is a paragraph in the Norwegian Constitution from 1814 saying that for all future, Norwegian kings should be coronated in this church. There had not been any royal coronations there since the 1500s, but that was part of the thinking of the people who signed the Constitution. And the very first coronation taking place here was in 1818 by King Karl Johan or Charles John, and all until 1905, there have been no coronations in Norway since then. All royal coronations have taken place in the cathedral. In 1869, the Norwegian Parliament decided an enormous, for the time, enormous project called the restoration of the Trondheim Cathedral. And during the 19th century, and that is my point here, the Trondheim Cathedral was established as one of the major national monuments in Norway. Despite its past as a Roman Catholic archbishop see, despite the fact that it was filled with medieval symbols and remnants, it became the national monument. It also, and that is typical still today in Norway, it also emphasized and strengthened the regional identity of the mid-Norway region around Trondheim, as then, and then of course challenging the identity of Oslo being the new capital. And of course, when you start a restoration project, architects suddenly became main actors. And since 1869, and I would say still today, the restoration project in Trondheim has been the object of deep and huge conflicts between different architects, between architects and historians, between architects, historians and theologians, and God knows what. So this has not been, in a way, a unifying project. It has been a conflict-making project, but the result is possible to see in Trondheim today. So there is an interesting contradiction here between Norway still being quite Lutheran in confessional terms, and this emphasis on medieval Roman Catholic cathedral as Norway's perhaps main national monument. And to give you an impression of how enormous this project actually was, I will show you 4 pictures. Up to the in the upper left corner, this is you see a photograph of the Trondheim Cathedral from 1860s. I would say 2/3 of the cathedral was in ruins. Just the eastern part was still in use and had been in use since the 1600s. So, and if you then see, so this was the starting point. This is the west front of the cathedral in 1860s, and this is the west front today. So this is the same side of the church. So I would say most of this is a 19th, early 20th century medieval cathedral, created by Norwegian architects. Of course, they were studying cathedrals in France, in England, and elsewhere. But this is actually a creation of the 19th and early 20th century, really creating an architectural monument of how leading architects and some historians thought that this cathedral could have been looking like if it actually had been completed, because it was not completed in the Roman Catholic time. So, that's that's the starting point, and that's the end point to the left. And if you see to down right, you see how this also created an enormous development of craft skills in Norway, because there was no one in Norway really knowing how to build a medieval cathedral in the 18th, 19th centuries. So they had to import specialists and create some kind of experimental studio for creating a medieval cathedral according to 19th century standards. An enormous effort, very interesting. And to the upper right, you see the other side of this interest for the Trondheim Cathedral, and that is finding what was left of the medieval kings of Norway. They actually stripped the cathedral for all its post-Reformation interior. They opened all the floors, looking for sarcophaguses with remnants of Norwegian kings from the medieval times. They didn't find much, but they created an enormous effort looking for it. So they stripped the whole church, and then they reconstructed it. And Norway didn't have many architects either in that period. So it was necessary, not only with regard to the restoration of Nidaros Cathedral or Trondheim Cathedral, but in general to create new modern churches in Norway. It was necessary to import architects from Denmark and from Germany mainly. And the 3 main of them are can you see here, from the left to the right, Hans-Dietrich Lindstow, Hans-Ernst Schirmer in the middle, and Karl-Heinrich Grosch to the right. These are the main architects, church architects in Norway. And they had very different ideals from Christian VI and the 18th century. Now, the modern churches were expected to be clean, white, nice, and warm, not least. So, to a certain degree, these architects created new churches with the help of the new Ministry of Ecclesiastical Affairs, who actually was very active in creating new ideals, new architectural ideals and models for church building in Norway. And many of these churches that I now will show you, now really the reformation of church architecture took place. Many of these new churches replaced, for instance, stave churches. So these churches built in the 1830s and onwards replaced old medieval churches, stone churches, and stave churches. So 80% of the Norwegian medieval state churches, they were torn down in this period and replaced by these modern churches. For instance, Kvinesdal Church in southern Norway, it was drawn by Lindstad. Again, white, nice, clean. It was a local lecture hall. Not very impressive seen from an aesthetic perspective, perhaps, but very functional. And many churches looked like that. This was some kind of a modeling of modern church architecture. Lindstad had another plan for smaller congregations. This is a quite late example from 1873. Lunde Church, also in southern Norway. Nice and clean, white. And an assembly hall for the minister and his flock. Very simple interior, normally just a cross as an altarpiece. This was in the rural areas. But there were also urban churches built in the same period. This is a Grosch church from 1833, the Immanuel Church in Halden, a town in southeastern Norway. A typical modern church for the urban, educated, meditative elite. The altarpiece is a copy of Bertel Thorvaldsen's very impressive monument of Christ in the Cathedral of Copenhagen, but it's in a smaller scale. You see nice, warm colors. This was one of the first churches that actually could be warmed up by fireplaces. And you see the classical dimensions of this, of course, but this was to actually please the urban elite. This was according to their religious ideals at the time. Grosch also designed a very interesting church in Kirkenes, not far from the Norwegian border to Russia. This is Kirkenes Church from 1862, and here you see a certain shift. This is a modern church, but it has also many details inspired by the stave churches that had been torn down in a large scale in the decades before. And it's possible to interpret this architecture as some kind of expression of Norwegianness at the border to Russia. So this is not, of course it's a church, it's a functional modern church, colors are light, etc., etc., but it also gives a statement of Norwegianness, this historical consciousness starting to develop, that Norway had some architectural elements of its own, and it was important to make a statement close to Russia, saying that here begins Norway, also aesthetically and architecturally. Unfortunately, this church was burned down during the last part of the Second World War, but there are many pictures of it. And another element, this is another architect, Nordan. This is also some kind of a 19th century pietist church. There are some classical details here. The colors are light, but the altarpiece is very meditative. It's Jesus embracing his, is it chill? No. Yeah. He's embracing his flock at least. So a very meditative piece. But as I said, in the 1860s, the shift took place with regard to evaluation of the stave churches. Most of them had been torn down by the time. But in the 1860s, many leading architects, historians, and also local people suddenly found out that, well, stave churches are actually an important part of Norwegian history. And in the 1860s, there was an enormous discussion about what to do with the Borgund stave church in western Norway. Many of the local farmers who didn't want to pay for two churches, they argued that the local stave church should be torn down. But there were national interests saying that, well, we should keep it as a local memory or a national memory site. And the result was this, where they actually decided to yes, decided to keep the old stave church as a monument, almost like a museum. And then the architect, he was the cathedral architect in Trondheim at the time, Christian Christi. He designed a new church situated 800 meters away, which became the church for the congregation. So they kept the old and the new just beside each other, and with also interesting architectural solutions with regard to how this was designed. Here to the left you see the Borgund church, as you still can see it, the stave church. And to the right is, amazingly enough, the interior of the new church from 1868, with many elements from the stave church interior. There are many references here to the stave church interior, but at the same time it's the colors are warm and light, and there is lots of light in here. So this is some kind of, I wouldn't say compromise, but a new way of finding architectural expressions for both the Middle Ages as part of Norwegian heritage, and at the same time giving expression to modern religious ideals of how a church should look like. Just a few words now at the end. I have mentioned that in the early 19th century, as in all the Nordic countries, there was the development of popular awakening movements or pietist movements. Many of them were deeply in conflict with the state churches and the ministers. During the 19th century, many of these popular pietist groups, they organized themselves in separate organizations. They created their own rituals, more simple than the rituals in the official church. They emphasized simplicity in aesthetics. Of course, they emphasized lay power in church, as opposed to the power of the ministers. They emphasized the vernacular and the local culture. And the question was, during all the 19th century, in all the Nordic countries, but definitely in Norway, should there be a permanent conflict between the official state church, the ecclesia, and these groups representing the ecclesiola ideology? And at least when it came to the Norwegian solution, there has never been a total conflict between the two cultures. There has been some kind of collaboration, but one solution then was not to leave the state church. These groups didn't leave the state church. They still were members, but they built their own houses, assembly houses. They didn't call them churches, but prayer houses, literally translated, bedehus in Norwegian, houses where you actually say your prayers. And many of them looked like ordinary dwelling houses. It was very little. If you pass this, for instance, it was called the House of Bethlehem. That's one thing, so you can see that it was a house dedicated to religious purposes. But except from that, it looked like an ordinary private house. This is from 1875. You also have the Bethesda in Norway from 1894, also looking like an ordinary house from the late 19th century. And you can see from the interior that it was very simple. There's some kind of pulpit here, some kind of an altar, but very little reminding of stave churches or modern church architecture as it was conceived in the 19th century. And it must be said that in present-day Norway, these prayer houses, they suffer the same destiny as the same churches. They are now torn down to a large extent because these organizations are simply dying out. There are no new members. So unfortunately, this is a part of the 19th century heritage that is disappearing as we speak. So there is large projects now going on documenting these houses, but whatever. Just some reflections, and this is the last page, so we have time for some questions. I think I'm not an art historian. I'm not an architect. I'm a simple historian. So I have tried to approach these both these images and the processes behind them as I see architecture as some kind of context and symbol for historical changes. I think also architecture, in this case church architecture, is interesting as sources for power relations and also for resistance to power. There are conflicts behind many of these architectural expressions. I think I'm right in saying that church architecture, in many ways, and it's quite commonplace actually to say that they express new religious ideals, but it has fascinated me as a historian to see to which extent actually a Lutheran church could be changed according to shifting ideological preferences. And of course, in these buildings and the architectural expressions, there has, through all these centuries, been, I wouldn't say conflict, but a tension between collective and individual needs and expression. There is, of course, architecture here representing modernization, but I think at least some of the 19th century architecture also show an interest for architecture being an expression of conservatism, that you actually keep historical elements that otherwise would have died out. And the last moment, the last issue here is that to be able to create, for instance, the Middle Ages, the medieval stave churches, or the medieval cathedral in Trondheim, to create that as the national symbols, it was necessary to, in a way, neutralize them historically. Because it was obvious to anyone that these were not expressions of a Lutheran state church culture. So that was why the main interpreters of these expressions of heritage have been architects and historians, and not ministers or theologians. So they had to be neutralized confessionally, hence making them possible as national symbols. Thank you.
Alors, si vous avez une ou deux questions.
We have time for one or two questions. If anybody would like to put a question, address a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. What surprised me is that in the Tida church, you used Baroque art, which was used by the counter-reformists. So I see a slight contradiction between that style and what was aimed at during the Reform.
Yes, I think you are very precise and correct in your observation. And of course, in many Norwegian churches during the previous century, that is the 17th century, the Baroque style actually became quite modern. So the case of Tyldal is an example of how you can build a new church, but then due to the lack of money, you have to take some elements from the older church, because there was a church in Tyldal before 1736. So this was also an expression of poverty. But of course, put into a new context, this was not a counter-reformation symbol any longer. It could have been a reminder of the previous century, but I think it is, in the Tyldal case, it's placed in a very new context, making it modern a la the 18th century.
Any more questions? Well, if there are no more questions, thank you for having listened to this lecture right to the end. Please return your headsets. And if you are interested in this topic, in the Oval Room, when you cross the courtyard, there's going to be a conference on the tapisserie de Bayeux, the Bayeux tapestry. You can take one of these programs that have been updated and you can get them at the entrance here. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant day. Thank you.